Okay, so we are recording. So Lauren, go ahead and introduce yourself. I'm going to go ahead and mute my microphone.
All right. So my name is Lauren Mart. I am a member of ADF and an Anglo-Saxon Heathen. I am not yet a member of the Troth, but that will probably be remedied very shortly. That's been a thing that's been on my consideration list for quite some time now. I am a newly ordained ADF priest. I'm the first Anglo-Saxon hearth culture priest in ADF. And this format is going to be pretty informal. I don't have PowerPoint slides. I don't have handouts. Obviously, it's hard to do handouts over the web. But what I wanted to kind of sit down and do is just let's talk through some of what makes Anglo-Saxon paganism Anglo-Saxon and why it's not just Scandinavian heathenry with funny names. Because it's one of those things where it can be a danger as an Anglo-Saxon heathen to decide we want to rely too much on outside sources and not on the sources that we do have. And we end up with just a list of names that we've translated into Anglo-Saxon, and we do the same things that, you know, that all of the other kinds of heathens do. And it takes away from the essential Anglo-Saxonness of, I talked with my hands, so you'll probably see me do this. It takes away some from the Anglo-Saxonness that makes it a viable hearth culture. So I'm going to kind of go through a list of things that make it particular. If I'm looking to my right, it's because I have my own notes up on a separate screen to the right of me. So I'm not, you know, like being sneaky. I just have my notes pulled up on another screen. So the first thing I want to talk about with the Anglo-Saxons is when. So the island of England is a place where there were Britons and Romans and Picts and Celts all living together under the Roman Empire. And then when the Roman Empire fell, around the time that the Romans were kind of disappearing from Roman Britain, we have an invasion of peoples from the Denmark, northern Germany area. And they come from tribes called things like Angles and Saxons and Jutes, which is why we call them Anglo-Saxons. And they settled in the southeast portion of the English island. So they didn't really make it all the way up to Scotland very much. And they didn't really make it out to Wales very much. But the central part of England was pretty thoroughly established between 400 and 700 CE. The other thing that was going on at the same time that all of this was going on is that these peoples were gradually, their power structure was gradually converting from one that was heathen to one that was Christian. So by the time the invasions are over and we've finished and the Anglos and Saxons and Jutes are all established in these small kingdoms on the island of England, they are mostly, or at least their hierarchy, is mostly Christian. So the only people that really did a lot of writing down about what was going on in Anglo-Saxon England were not heathens. They spoke Latin, but they also spoke Old English. And there were a couple of kings who thought it was really important to write things down in the native vernacular. But what they didn't write down was any books about their religion. They wrote down things about their culture in some cases. They wrote down poetry. They wrote down, there's books about calendars from some monks from Mead. There's books of healing, leechcraft, which is the art of healing, which is often herbalism. Very strong tradition of herbal healing in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. There are riddles in a book called the Exeter Book. And so we have this tradition of knowing that they enjoyed word games. And so we can put together a lot about what their poetic culture was like. But in very few places in any of these documents do we have anything written down about what the pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon religion looked like. So where do we get anything from about the pre-Christian Anglo-Saxons. We have to look at place names. We have to look at grave goods. We have to look at what other cultures were saying about them. And we have to look at their literature and kind of pick out the important bits from what we know. So there's a couple of things that influenced that later on. One of the things that influenced that later on is that the Danes and then the Norwegians and the Swedes came back in the 11th through the 13th centuries and marched their way across the English continent, the English island again. And so we have a re-invasion of Germanic lore into England. And that is not Anglo-Saxon practice. That's Swedish and Norwegian and Danish. That's a different religious practice. And what came in at the later dates was later. So it had had a couple more hundred years of pre-Christian influence to develop into its own thing. And so a lot of what you see when we talk about the Anglo-Saxon religion is pre what you see when you talk about Scandinavian heathenry. And that's simply because what we know about the Anglo-Saxons is that they stopped being heathens, or at least their power structure stopped being heathens, considerably before the power structure of the other Scandinavian and Icelandic cultures became Christian. And so they had more time to develop their religious structures. So their myths are a little more sophisticated. They have more gods, they have more goddesses, they have more spirits. There's more stuff that got written down because they had more exposure to people who were in cultures that were practicing book literacy. The Angles and Saxons had runes, but they didn't typically write in books until they got the Latin alphabet. And so there's a lot we have to trace backwards from when we're looking at a Scandinavian source. We're going to what did it look like when it was on the continent, because that's the original source. The original source is on the continent. We have the Anglo-Saxon as a daughter culture. We also have the Scandinavian and then the Icelandic as daughter cultures. And they kind of branch off and do their own separate things. So as we look at the Scandinavian sources and we look at the Anglo-Saxon sources, we can see that there are times when they do connect. And those are usually times when we have something that we have in common that we can pretty well trust. But you don't want to just go to a Norse source and outsource it directly back into the Anglo-Saxon culture, because we don't know that the cultures had that kind of contact or that the cultures had that kind of importance. And we'll talk about what some of the differences in those two things would be a little later. I'm going to take a brief diversion and say, screw you, Henry VIII, because one of the things that Henry VIII did when he decided he wasn't going to be Catholic anymore was he burned down most of the monasteries of England. And if you burn down monasteries, and monasteries are where people keep books, you're going to burn down most of the written record of anything that was going on before Henry VIII in England. So there's lots that we probably could have known about the Anglo-Saxons that was being kept in these monastery libraries that Henry VIII lit on fire. So if you ever get really frustrated with the lack of sources, you can probably thank Henry for that. You can thank him for a lot of other things, but this one is the one that really bothers me. So as we talk about what we don't know, so that's what we don't know. We don't have a Snorri. We don't have a Saxo. We don't have an equivalent Christian or later source that thought it was important to write down the myths of the Anglo-Saxons. That said, there's a whole lot that we do know. It just isn't quite as easily accessible. So the first thing that people always ask about when we talk about Anglo-Saxon heathenry is, well, who are your gods? So there are fewer of them than there are in the Icelandic and Scandinavian sources, but most of them have equivalents. Some of them don't. We have Woden, obviously. We also have his wife, Freya. who, depending on who you ask, may be both Frigg and Freya, or may not be, because when we trace that goddess name back linguistically, they both come from the same source. So we don't know if in the Germanic continent, when we were still on the continent, there was only one goddess. We know when they got to Anglo-Saxon, there is no attestation of two separate goddesses that do these two separate functions. So a lot of us put a lot of those two separate functions of Frigg and Freya under Frigga, which is F-R-I-G-E. The G is usually pronounced as a Y in Anglo-Saxon, so when you see that, like the word year is spelled D-E-A-R. So Frigga is a goddess of both the home and the hearth, and also of magic, especially spinning magic. We have two, who probably still has both his hands, because that's a later myth. We have Thunor, who is very much like Thor in his role as a protector of Midgard. We have Ing, who, if you are in a Scandinavian source, you will know him as Frey. Ing is his first name. That is his proper name. So sometimes he's called Ing Frey, which just means Lord Ing. We have Saxnat, which we know absolutely nothing about, other than that the people who lived in Saxony worshipped him. We don't know anything about what he was like, except that he was important. We have Sunna and Mona, the sun and the moon. We have Hel, so we do have a goddess of the underworld. And then there is a point in Beowulf where Hama is referenced, and that's Heimdall. And then we have Eostre and Hertha. And they're only referenced in Bede, in De Tempore Rationalis, which is on the reckoning of time. So Bede thought it was important to write down what the Anglo-Saxon calendar was. And a lot of what we know about the day-to-day religious practices of the Anglo-Saxons comes from Bede, because he thought to write down what their calendar was. And their calendar, of course, like most ancient calendars, focused around their religious celebrations. So we know that it was a lunar solar calendar. They had an extra month in the middle of summer sometimes, so that the spring months were always in the spring, more like the Jewish calendar. So if you look at the Jewish calendar, Hanukkah is always in December. If you look at the Islamic calendar, Ramadan moves all around the year. So the Islamic calendar is purely lunar. The Jewish calendar is lunar solar. The Anglo-Saxon calendar is also lunar solar, to preserve what months we did what things, so that they stayed concurrent with the actual seasons. And we have the Earth Mother. And this is one of the things that makes me personally very happy as an ADF pagan, is that the Earth Mother is very well respected and honored in ADF, but she doesn't have a true analog in some of our hearth cultures. But the Anglo-Saxons are one of the hearth cultures that have an Earth Mother, and she's just called Earth Mother. Like, she doesn't have a name. But there are poems to the earth, and they call on her as Earthen Mother, to bless their fields and to charm, to pray, or do magic, to bless their fields. So those are most of your gods. Of those, we know nothing about Saxnat, except he was the primary god of the people who settled in Exeter. Hama was mentioned in Beowulf. Eostre and Hertha are only given names in Bede. Sunna and Mona just means sun and moon in Old English. Ing and Tu we find in genealogies and in the rune poem, because we do have a rune poem for the Anglo-Saxons. We'll talk more about runes in a minute. And Woden, Frigga, and Thunor are in place days and in the days of the week. You can Anglo-Saxonize pretty much any Norse deity by translating their name into Anglo-Saxon. Gerda, for instance, becomes Yarda, which is related to our word for yard, which makes sense if you think of Gerda as the goddess of the walled garden. But we don't actually have anybody in the Anglo-Saxon tradition that references Ing having a wife, or that wife was from the Ettins, which is their name for giants. So you could, if you wanted to, bring her in, but it would truly be bringing her in from a sister culture. So it's not strictly wrong, but it's also not strictly right either. It's kind of in a gray area, and every Anglo-Saxon heathen kind of has to make a decision about how much they're going to listen to or rely on Norse sources for what we do, because I personally like to stick to pretty closely to the Anglo-Saxon sources. And we can talk about at the end some good authors where you can look to find pretty consistent Anglo-Saxon information. Unfortunately, most of those books are not cheap. But we can talk about where to find more information about this kind of stuff as we go through the program. So those are the gods. The next thing I want to talk about is the divisions of the cosmos, because people always talk about the 9 worlds. So instead of Yggdrasil, which is the world tree, we have the Irminsul, which is a world pillar. And we have 7 worlds instead of 9, and nobody bothered to write down what they were. So our realm is probably Midgard, which means Middle Earth. But beyond that, your guess is as good as mine. We can translate on Asgard, which is probably Asgard. But we don't ever have a place where anybody wrote down what the divisions of the cosmos were. We just know that there were 7 of them. As far as the calendar goes, we have weekdays that talk about at least some of the deities that we know were part of the Anglo-Saxon tradition. And if you are an English-speaking person, you probably know these just by listening to them. We have Mona's Day, we have Tuesday, we have Woden's Day, we have Thunor's Day, we have Frigga's Day, we have Saturn's Day, thanks Romans, and we have Sunna's Day. So the moon, Tu, the god of justice, of the North Star, Woden, Thunor, Frigga, and Sunna. And then we have the calendar of the lunar months. So when we talk about the lunar months, what matters is how much you trust Bede. There are some Anglo-Saxon scholars that think Bede made this all up. There are other Anglo-Saxon scholars who think, why would he make up stuff when this was interesting enough to write it down? So take Bede with a grain of salt. He was a Christian monk, and he was a chronicler, which if you know anything about the tradition of people writing histories in English, you know that it was never without motive. Always look for the motive when somebody is writing down something in this time period. So Bede was absolutely writing with a motive. And we don't necessarily know what that was, but we know we have to take a little bit of a grain of salt with what he's telling us. But we know that the first month of the year, these are lunar months, is the month after Yule. February is the month of cakes. Either that or it's the month of sand. And there's some question as to whether or not this references coarsely ground dried grains. So if you've ever eaten a polenta cake, you know they can be kind of coarse if the polenta is not really fine. And polenta cake is totally not even remotely an English thing. They would never have been growing corn. But you can imagine a cake that would be a little gritty. And it's not gritty because it has sand in it. It's gritty because the grains are coarsely ground. Also because those cakes were sacrificed to the earth in February, because that's when you started planning your planting for the season. March was Hrethmonath, and there is some question about who Hreth or Rita was. Her name eventually becomes Leda in some dialects of English, and that month was still called that in parts of Southwest England until as recently as the 19th century. So these are, this one we can guess is probably comes from somewhere. And all we know is that that offerings were made to her in this month. Her name might mean strong, it might mean something related to fertility. We don't really know. It's kind of one of those words where we're guessing at its origin based on the etymology, not because somebody wrote down in a dictionary what that word means. April corresponds with Eostromonath, which is another mysterious pagan deity named Eostre. She is thought to have been a goddess of the dawn who was honored with a festival around the time of the spring equinox, which is why in English we call that celebration Easter, because that celebration was so well grounded that unlike most of the rest of Europe who call the festival of Easter some variation on Pascha, which is Latin for Passover, we actually call it Easter. And that has to do specifically with the fact that there was a celebration that was so entrenched in England at the time that the Christian church was like, well, screw it, we'll just rename this, we'll rename the holiday. But no account of her is written down anywhere other than in Mead. So we don't really know what she was the goddess of. Her name is cognate with a lot of other Indo-European dawn goddesses, and is cognate with just the word east, which is where the sun comes up. So she may have been a dawn goddess. She may just have been a goddess of the people who came from the east, and that was how she got her name. There's some question about that. I personally work with her as a dawn goddess, but that's my own UPG, so take from that what you will. May was Thrimilka, which is the month of three milkings, because there's so much grass that the cows are making so much milk that we have to milk them 3 times a day. This was probably entirely fiction, but it has something to do with the fact that people ate a lot of cheese in the spring because there wasn't a whole lot of other things to eat. June and July together are known as Litha, which is an Old English word meaning mild or gentle, which June and July, it's summer. This is the happy time of the year. The month of June is before Litha, the month of June is after Litha, and in the years when we have a leap month, when we have an extra moon in the year, the one in the middle is called Thrilitha, or third mild. So the leap year portion of the year is in the middle of the year. August was Weodmonath, or the month of weeds or plants. And September was Haligmonath, which is holy month, where celebrations and festivals would be held to celebrate a successful summer's crop. During this time, there's some attestation for a harvest goddess to be drawn around in a wagon, which is reminiscent of Nerthus in all but name. And so this is where we get some of our Earth Mother traditions about the goddess being drawn in a wagon, and the celebrations of fertility and celebrations of peace around this time of year. If you want to go back to the Germans that Tacitus talks about, there's some continuity there. October was the winter full moon, Winterfilth, because winter begins on the first full moon of October. November is the month of blood sacrifices, which nobody is quite sure what that means, but we guess it probably means something to do with culling the herds of animals so that the animals that we didn't think we could keep living through the winter would be sacrificed for food. And then December is the month before Yule. So we have before Midsummer and after Midsummer, we have before Yule and after Yule, and then the rest of the months of the year actually refer to what was going on in our agricultural life. If you really want to fall into the rabbit hole that is the Anglo-Saxon calendar, let me know. I can send you a link to some people who have done a whole lot more research than I will ever do on it. That's as in-depth on it as I feel I need to go at this point in my religious career. But there's some people that have gotten really specific about it to the point where they've actually gone through and tracked which years have the leap year in it to make the calendar continue making sense. So if you want to follow this calendar yourself, I can send you to a calendar where it's all broken down for you. So that's the calendar. Let's talk about the runes. So if you read runes, most of you read with the Elder Futhark, F-U-T-H-A-R-K. Those come from Denmark, and there are 24 of them. They are the parent alphabet, but we don't have a rune poem to go with the Elder Futhark. In the daughter cultures of that Germanic group, which is the Icelandic and Norwegian, they both have a rune poem, and the Anglo-Saxons have a rune poem. So Anglo-Saxon as a language, however, has all these influences that are coming in from other places, has a lot more vowels than the language that was spoken in Germanic Denmark. So all of a sudden, we need more letters because if we're going to write down our words, you need a letter for every sound. And we have more sounds, so we need more letters. So there's 29 runes in the Anglo-Saxon Futhorc, because the rune Ansus becomes the rune Os, that A becomes an O, and we have 3 other A or AE or AI runes that come later in the alphabet. What we know about the Anglo-Saxon rune poem is that it's considerably nicer than the Icelandic or Norwegian rune poems. My personal opinion hat on, is that this is because the climate in England is considerably nicer, and so living in England was considerably nicer, and so our thoughts about the world and the way the world works and the way the cosmos works are a little friendlier than the way the world and the cosmos works in places like Iceland and Norway, which are much harsher climates. But that's purely conjecture on my part and some other people. I didn't come up with that myself. But if you read with the rune poem, the Anglo-Saxon rune poem is a complete document. And if you do divination with the runes, you can in fact use just the Anglo-Saxon runes and just the Anglo-Saxon rune poem and have a very effective form of divination. So if any of you have ever seen me read runes in ritual, you know that sometimes I come up with some different names for things and have some slightly different meanings. That's because I read with the Anglo-Saxon runes and not with the Elder Futhark. I just got a book, and I'm going to show it off here. It's coming in back, called The English Runes. It's by Suzanne Rance with a foreword by Stephen Pollington. If you're interested in reading with the Anglo-Saxon runes as a divination system, this is an excellent book because it goes through the runes one by one and talks about the rune poem and what the rune poem means, like different translations of it, as well as how it would have fit into the Anglo-Saxon society. So not just that feo means cattle, but what cattle meant to the Anglo-Saxons as a people. Very interesting book, highly recommended. Next thing I want to talk about is elves. So if you want to get down with Anglo-Saxon paganism, you have to be comfortable with elves, because there are so many different kinds of elves, and so much of what we know about their religious beliefs revolve around elves. And if you think about all of the different kinds of spirits that are attested in England and folk belief today, that is a direct result of the fact that the Anglo-Saxons were very strong believers that there were spirits in everything. There are wood elves and stone elves and tree elves and river elves and water elves and all different kinds of elves. And most of them are ambivalent at best to humans. And the ones that aren't ambivalent are usually hostile. We have lots of poems and cures for people who have been elf shot or elf poisoned. There's a whole culture around these beings that are not human, but exist in the same plane as humans, or sort of the same plane as humans, and who come into contact with what we do and where we live. And some of them inhabit our homes, which is where we get things like hobs and brownies. Some of them inhabit our barns, and that's why you get traditions of sacrifices made when a new barn is put up. There is usually an animal sacrifice buried in either the lintel of the barn or in one of the walls, because we're making sacrifices to the elves who live there. Very strong traditions of spirits of place. It's not just tree elves as a whole. It's the elf in this tree. It's the elf in this forest. It's the elf in this spring. And they all have their own personalities, and they all have their own mindsets, and they all have their own gifts that they like. Most of them like dairy products, so milk is never a bad offering if you're making an offering to the elves. They also frequently like porridge. The hob in my stove really likes oatmeal, which is good because I also like oatmeal, so my morning routine is to make oatmeal and share it with the hob. But as you go through all of these different kinds of elves, you start to get a picture of how elves to the Anglo-Saxons were a huge part of their expectations of the other world. We don't know a whole lot about what their expectations of the other world was with their gods. We don't know a whole lot about what the expectations of the other worlds were with their ancestors, except that they were a mound culture. So they did bury their dead in mounds, and believed that you could do magic with the dead in the mound. So we know that there was, some understanding of ancestors that looked over the family, and we can talk about whether those were elves or ancestors. That's always a good question. And just like that question exists in the Scandinavian sources, that question exists in the Anglo-Saxon sources as well. If we have buried our dead in the mound, the important dead in the mound, if we have buried our grandmothers in the mound for generations, when we go to the mound to work magic, are we working just with the magic of the dead, or have they become elves? Have they become place spirits of that mound? That your guess is as good as mine. The book to recommend if you are interested in elves is Elves in Anglo-Saxon England by Alaric Hall, or also, hang on, Karen Jolly's Elf Charms in Context, which is a book about the later English culture and how it interacts with the Anglo-Saxons. As we talk about religion, so far, all that we've really been able to talk about is the structure of what was written down. What we know about the Anglo-Saxons culturally is that they were a tribal culture. They did have they were a warband culture. And we don't know for sure what their religious hierarchy looked like. We think there was probably a role for women, but none of that got written down. And we don't know if that didn't get written down because it wasn't considered important, or because those roles were primarily hearth-based and home-based, or because it was all written down by Christian monks who, generally speaking, don't have a particularly high opinion of women. So there could be lots of reasons for that particular bit of information being missing. Stephen Pollington talks about the priesthood in Anglo-Saxon cultures as kind of troublesome because it really only exists through secondary sources. And what we know about it is that somebody had to preside over the rituals and somebody had to take care of the religious items, but who those people were and how they were chosen, we don't have any idea. That's not something that we know a whole lot about. Pollington says perhaps instead of calling them priests, it would be more applicable to call them ritual specialists, because they were not probably priests in the same way that Christian priests were shepherds of their people and doing all of the kind of work with the poor, and they were a part of the established hierarchy of the tribal culture, and in some cases may have even been the warband chief. The leader of the tribal group was also the leader of the tribal religion, and it was his job to focus on what the religious beliefs of his people were going to be, what their sacrifices were going to be. We do know that they practiced in groves. So they did practice their religion outside, which is always interesting to me because they came into a culture that had been run by Romans. And Roman temples are usually big stone buildings. And the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes, when they came to England, did not just take over those big stone buildings and Vikingize them. They instead created their own worship spaces, whether that's because they were respectful of the Roman spaces as being to someone else's gods, or because they didn't understand or grok on a religious level of a permanent temple versus an outdoor temple, or because they were already crumbling ruins by the time they got there. Nobody really knows. But for whatever reasons, the Anglo-Saxons practiced their religion either in the Mead Hall, which we'll talk about in a minute, or in groves outside. And we have places where things are named, you know, Hunor's Grove and Freya's Grove, copses of trees that are named for deities. And best guess is that they were used for some kind of religious purpose. So leading these groups is some kind of officiant. He's a leader in the community who holds sway in religious, legal, and secular matters. They would preside at feasts, in acts of worship, at court, and in war, and they would mediate with the gods on behalf of their community, as well as keeping safe the holy objects used in ceremonies. And this is coming straight from Stephen Pollington's The Elder Gods, which, if you want a great book on Anglo-Saxon religion, I know it's expensive, but there's just not a better resource out there right now that covers the length and breadth of the religion. So that's a good one to get through interlibrary loan if you just want to read it. It's dense, it's a textbook, but it really is the best source out there on this kind of thing. Speaking of Stephen Pollington, he also has a book called The Mead Hall, and it is entirely about Mead Hall culture. I will be the first to admit I haven't read this one yet. There are lots of things that I have read, but this one is on my bookshelf, but it hasn't made it into the read pile yet. One of the ways that you can look at things that are important to a culture is to look at the language of that culture and see what the words actually are. And Anglo-Saxon has so many words that have to do with mead halls that we can only presume that the mead hall culture was super important to them, because they have specific words for mead tables and mead horns and mead toasts and mead women and mead benches. And there are benches and then there are mead benches. And, you know, there are tables and then there are mead tables. And so it's really a part of the culture to have this mead hall experience. So what is a mead hall? A mead hall was a central gathering place for the tribal culture. And it was a central rite of the culture that established social precedents. It established military precedents. It established who you were and where you stood in your society. It would have been where oaths were made and where our bonds of community were reestablished through formal ceremonies. The chieftain, part of what makes a chieftain is that he can take care of his people. And he can feed them, and so you have mead feasts, and he can reward people through this reciprocal hospitality that he experiences as the chieftain of the society. Mead hall culture establishes those roles, and there is an excellent little pamphlet on the role of women in mead hall culture by, by Kathleen Herbert. It's called Peace Weavers and Shield Maidens, Women in Early English Society. And she wrote this. It's a transcript of a lecture series that she did on the role of women. And just like there were established roles for women in Norse societies, and how women as keepers of frith and as keepers of the bonds of the social environment in the community, that existed in Anglo-Saxon culture as well. So that sister element is for sure there in both cultures. Cultural signposts there are where you learn whether you are in favor with or out of favor with your chieftain. It's where decisions are made. It's where religious ceremonies of some sort are had, and it's the central meeting place of a village that has a tribal chieftain. As the tribes conglomerated and became kingdoms, and there were a number of kingdoms on the island of England before they all became English. They didn't all become English until later on. But you think of the kingdom Northumbria and Mercia and Sussex and Wessex. These are all kingdoms that existed in England. These grew out of conglomerations of these tribes into larger and larger hierarchies as the tribal cultures settled in Anglo-Saxon England. And they were often at war with each other. In fact, that was kind of the defining culture of the kingdoms at the time, was that they were constantly at war with each other. And they embraced Christianity over the course of this warring period. And the last king was King Penda. And I believe he was it's like 1750, or excuse me, 750, sorry, not 1750. In 750 CE is when we have the last pagan king is defeated by the king of Mercia, and the Anglo-Saxons are completely Christianized. So after that, we're talking about Christian Anglo-Saxons as opposed to heathen Anglo-Saxons. One of the other things that ties the Anglo-Saxon culture to the Scandinavian cultures is this idea of fate. The Anglo-Saxons called it wyrd, W-Y-R-D, and it is not quite the same as the Greek idea of fate, and it's not quite the same as the idea of orlog. It's the origin of our word weird, English word weird, like weird things, in the same sense that we talk about the Weird sisters in Macbeth. Weird is the web of cause and effect that exists around us. Some of it you get from your ancestors, some of it you make for yourself, but all of us, especially those of us who raise the Mead horn together, are affected by it. My weird affects all those close to me, much like if you pluck a string on a net, all the other strings are affected. If something weird happens, it must be that web of connectivity coming into play, or at least that's the original meaning of the word. So the original meaning of the word wasn't that things were strange, so much as it was that things that were happening on a cosmological level that were affected by the cause and effect of our actions in this world. We don't have specifically named Norns, but there are definitely throughout English literature the idea of three witches doing things. So are the three witches the Norns? Does Shakespeare, are the Weird sisters in Macbeth really a descendant of the idea of weird? Is it really that well established in our culture that there will always be three witches? Maybe. And that's one of the cool things about studying the Anglo-Saxons, is that we live in a culture that is descended from the Anglo-Saxons. And so there are frequently little things that will pop up, like the three witches, that we see now that we know existed back in the progenitor culture that established what became modern English. And so that's one of the things that always has, that one has always fascinated me. And I think it's Branston in his Lost Gods of England that talks about fate and weird and the Weird Sisters. If you're ever interested in following a scholarly discussion of where that idea comes from and how it traces down through English literature to be something that is now even recognized by children everywhere who read fairy tales. So that's a little bit about Anglo-Saxon culture, kind of in a rapid fire nutshell. When we talk about what the Anglo-Saxons did, what do I do as an Anglo-Saxon pagan? I build relationships is what I do as an Anglo-Saxon pagan. I make offerings, I make sacrifices, and I receive in return for those gifts from the spirits that I work with and that I worship. And I'm not one of those people who really hates the idea of working with spirits, because there are definitely some spirits that I do work with, but I worship my gods. And I'm not afraid of that word, because that's really the correct word for the relationship that I have with them. An altar in Anglo-Saxon is a weophon. It literally means the place where you keep your weo, your symbols of your gods. So an altar or a shrine is a place where you keep the symbols of your gods, and you make offerings there. You gather with your kindred, your kin, whether they are your family of choice or your family of blood or some combination therein, and you make offerings as a group, and you strengthen your weird with each other. The act of making offerings, of making gifts to the gods, strengthens the bonds of community, and it strengthens our bonds with each other. And this is where I really enjoy being the leader of a small group that primarily works in the Germanic hearth culture in ADF, because we really do believe strongly in the idea of our weird is connected. And when we make sacrifices together, our fates are intertwined. And when someone makes an oath, we are all responsible to that person and to the oath that they might make. You might have a weophod thing, which literally means altar priest. Somebody who coordinates the offerings with the gods and spirits. You might not. You might simply have the head of the family or a person who is good at leadership who does that work. And you toast the kindreds. You tie your word and your weird to your kindred, even if you are separated at a distance. We don't have a ton of stuff to go on for this, but the research that's out there on Anglo-Saxon groups is that the tribe and the tribal culture was very strong. The idea of our bonds to our family, our bonds to the leader of our group, and those are the bonds that tie us together and within which we approach our religious observance. So that tribe mentality is one that you can cultivate, and the one that I try to cultivate in my own group. They become kind of like a second family, because they are your kindred, they are your kin, just like my mom and dad, who aren't pagan at all, are my kin. My family in my ADF group are my kin, because we make sacrifices together and our fates are tied together by that. Make offerings, make sacrifices, receive blessings. It's not called to bloat, but the idea is kind of the same. In fact, we don't know what the word is. Alaric Albertson suggests the huso, which means sacrifice. but I have no idea, as I have not worked with a number of other Anglo-Saxon heathens, whether anybody other than Alaric has ever used that word. So that's the practical doing of Anglo-Saxon heathenry is similar to the practical doing of any other kind of heathenry, where you gather together with your kin or by yourself with your kin at a distance and make offerings and receive blessings together as you tie your word and your weird to each other. And that's where I run out of notes. So I'd like to open this up for questions, fully disclaiming that I am not the most learned expert on Anglo-Saxons that there is out there. So you may ask me questions and I may say, I don't know. But if there's something I don't know, I'll usually be able to give you somewhere to look to find that kind of thing. So if you have questions, please speak up. Nope. Nobody?
I don't have a question, but just to throw in a comment as general context. So sub-Roman Britain was conquered more or less by 600 CE. Most of the kingdoms had converted by 700 CE, with King Penda holding up another generation or two. But in any case, Anglo-Saxon paganism, as we know it, existed at least at the state level for only about a century or so, right?
Right.
So, and given, as you said, they were warring with each other, they had better things to do than write stuff down. But I don't know, have you ever read the book by Bill Griffiths? I think it's called Anglo-Saxon Magic.
I have it. I have not read it, but I have it because it has that book has a lot of great original texts in the back.
Yes. Well, he theorizes that Anglo-Saxon paganism was largely a local affair. You know, every family worshipped its local elves, or at least placated them to propitiate them to stay away. They honored their ancestors. As far as deities were the reserve of powerful families or royal houses. And he basically structures an Anglo-Saxon paganism that's very localized and very loose and decentralized. And so I think any Anglo-Saxon group has to take that into consideration, that the gods are things that might have been reserved for the occasional festival thrown by the local prevailing family in the area. You know, when my own kindred just got together and decided what gods we worshipped, it was kind of, I don't want to say happenstance, but I mean, we stuck to the ones that were more or less attested in the Anglo-Saxon corpus, but there was really no rhyme or reason as to why we chose other than personal proclivities. So
right.
throwing that out there, that, you know, the deities are perhaps not the end all and be all of the average Anglo-Saxon out there.
Right, absolutely. And the idea of a decentralized paganism is, I mean, the Anglo-Saxon communities themselves were very decentralized. They were small local kingdoms, local tribes that became local kingdoms. There was not a lot of formal religious hierarchy in the sense that, especially not in the sense the kind of hierarchy that they ran into once they ran into the Christians. So yeah, it would have been a very local affair, and it would have been very place oriented. And I think you see that even among the UPG of Anglo-Saxons working with their gods. You get I've always gotten a very strong sense that place and locality and the spirits of place are an important part of worship, even when you are dealing with the gods, even of the gods that are, you know, so much bigger than the place spirits. There's an inherent groundedness in your location that I think is something that should be considered with anybody who's practicing Anglo-Saxon paganism, because they are your elves that you have to take care of. And the elves that I deal with here in Houston are going to be different than the elves that a kindred deals with in Virginia, who will be different than a kindred deals with the elves in Maine, just because the local place spirits are different. Anybody else?
Well, since no one else wants to speak up, let me just throw one other thing out there. There's always one of the central questions in Anglo-Saxon heathenry is, to what extent do you internalize some of the later Norse mythology or Norse poetry, i.e., there's no evidence of Loki existing in England prior to Danish invasions. There's very little evidence that they internalized the Ragnarok myth as it was written down later. If it's not too personal, how much of Norse religion do you bring into your Anglo-Saxon practice, and how much do you leave out?
I leave out most of the Norse stuff, honestly. I approach Loki as much as I would a trickster deity in any pantheon that was not my own. I approach the Ragnarok myth as I would approach any end of the world destruction myth in a pantheon that was not my own. I try hard not to be too reliant on UPG. I think most Anglo-Saxons have to be reliant on UPG to a certain extent, just because there's so much that we don't know. But the things that we know for sure were inserts from the later Norse invasions that don't have any context in the prior Anglo-Saxon sources, I tend to leave out. And I found, just to go down the UPG train a little bit further, that there is often, when I work with the Anglo-Saxon deities, there is an inherent Englishness or Anglo-Saxonness about them that makes them feel different. They feel like a sister or cousin culture to when I've worked with the Norse deities. They are not, Thunor is not Thor. They have a lot in common. They're clearly related, and you can translate the relationship with one to the relationship with the other. And if you ask me to define exactly why they're different, I would have a hard time doing that, because this is a gut feeling kind of thing just based on UPG. But in my experience working with those spirits, they are not just carbon copies of their Norse counterparts.
Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the recording then. And